Okay, I'm glad. I am here to introduce the next session, and my friend Brian Siegel. A great part about your partnership with BAM or Lauren Ward, as we know, is access to partners who bring value to the relationships you have with your client, and I can hardly think of a better one than First Element Insurance Partners. Our advisors lean strongly on them to help figure out complex issues related to risk management in their clients' lives. And so with that, I introduce Brian for his presentation, Business Continuation. Failing to plan is planning to fail.
Thank you.
From the wise words of George Schweitzer.
That's right.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. Full disclosure, as you can tell, my voice doesn't sound very good. So I woke up this morning and had almost no voice. So of course I was in a panic, and with a steady dose of tea throughout the day and throat lozenges, which I have as well, I'm able to talk, so in short doses. So I'll be hitting the water and tea quite regularly. I apologize in advance, but I'll be looking for audience participation too, to give me breaks every so often. So I know we won't have a problem with that with a couple of you. All right, so we're here to talk about succession planning. And when we talk about what succession planning is, it's a process for identifying, yes, new owners, and that's what everyone always thinks of. When a business is going to transition, then who is going to take over, right? Whether it's going to be a family member, whether it is going to be potentially an outsider, it could be an employee, but everyone's always thinking, okay, who is the buyer going to be, or who is the new family owner who's going to take over going to be? But there's a much more important question in my mind, which is, who is the leader going to be? And who's appropriate, who's equipped to be able to take over the business? I just was in a meeting last week with the owner of a property and casualty insurance firm. And he has a daughter involved in his business. He is in his mid-60s, and I asked him, of course, when do you want to get out of the business? And everyone's answer, you probably experienced this too, is always, oh, I'd get out tomorrow if I could. But then there's a but, and that but is, you know, my daughter is going to take over, but I think we need to have a 10-year plan because she's not going to be ready. And so, again, figuring out who's equipped to be able to take over the business is a whole nother issue from just identifying who is going to take over without the leadership skills. So they have to have the appropriate leadership skills. And it's upon certain triggering events. The ones that people always think of are death, disability, retirement, disagreement, right? So if two business owners own a business together and they can't agree on things, then how do they exit out? Get some really interesting situations with disagreements. And then involuntary transfer as well. That's a common one that should be planned for within a buy-sell agreement, which we'll talk more about later, but isn't always accounted for. So that sounds all great, but according to a 2016 nationwide small business owner survey, 60% of businesses with fewer than 300 employees actually have a plan in place. So the plan is not out there, and when it is out there, it tends to be outdated. As part of our offering, we have a process called business succession evaluation, and it's the review of an existing succession plan or mapping out a plan for an existing business that doesn't have a succession plan. And through that process, it is amazing how many companies have been around for years and either don't have a plan, or the ones that have had a plan in place but it's been there for 10, 15, 20 years, they haven't updated it. They've never had the buy-sell agreement reviewed. They haven't reviewed the funding. Then whether it's the buy-sell agreement or whether it's the funding that's in place, i.e. life insurance in the event of a death situation, I've seen cases where there were, this is going back 30 plus years, where the prior generation had created the succession plan. And when it came down to it, now there are three brothers, all in their late 60s or early 70s, and they had $250,000 whole life insurance policies in place to fund a buyout. So 3 people, $750,000 to fund a buyout. when I asked the question, so what's the value of the business? What would you estimate it to be worth? It's probably worth about $3 million. Yeah, that $750,000 wasn't going to go real far, and you see that all the time, though, where again the plan has to keep up with the business, and it doesn't usually. So through this survey, the most common reasons that business owners didn't plan, number one is that it's not necessary. Well, yeah, a business owner is busy running the day-to-day affairs of the business, and they're not thinking about selling the business or transitioning out. They're thinking, well, I don't need to now because I'm not thinking about selling my business. But what if there is an unforeseen event that occurs? And how much lead time do you really need to be able to sell the business and maximize value? We'll talk more about that. If they are aware that planning is necessary, but at the same time, they don't want to get out because they see the value of the business and they think, well, I've grown this since it was nothing. And a lot of times these business owners have spent a whole lot more time with the business than they have their own kids. So it is their baby. And then there's not knowing when to create a plan. And this is where I put it more with a lot of the advisors, because what I find is that attorneys are terrible about this, where they don't actually tell clients, okay, now's a good time to start planning for transition of the business. They may get together every year and put together corporate minutes and review the business needs each year from a legal standpoint, but they don't talk about succession planning. Same thing goes with the CPAs, right? They're busy helping out with the tax consequences situations, trying to get additional deductions, whatever the case may be. And in the end, they're not advising the client on when they should start planning to exit the business. I was just at an event yesterday. I didn't lie, but thank God for tea. I was just at an event yesterday where the speaker put it really well, where she said, for a lot of people, they would tell you that the time to start planning for the exit strategy with the business is the day that you form the business. It's true. You really do have to start planning early. And we'll talk more about timing later, but at the same time, at least having that unforeseen event plan in place. If there was death, disability, something that is not foreseen, then making sure that there's some kind of plan in place. Not having time. So, you all know how busy your business owner clients are in the day-to-day affairs of the business. They're so busy running the business that they won't take the time to actually develop a plan. They're not going to proactively contact the attorney and say, hey, let's talk about succession planning. It doesn't happen. So that's probably a legitimate one. This last one, I like to think that maybe this is not as big of an issue as it used to be, being overwhelmed with government regulations. I suppose for some businesses it is, but for our discussion today, it's not really relevant. So the end result of all that is that there's a failure of businesses because of the failure to plan. Estimated 30% of family-owned businesses survive to the second generation, only 12% makes it to the third generation, and only 3% make it to the fourth generation. Businesses fail. And I can tell you from personal experience in my own family. So, how many people are familiar with the hideaway bed? Right? Yeah. So my great-grandfather invented the hideaway bed. And I've been big on genealogy lately on Ancestry.com. I just found out that he also invented the rollaway cot. Had no idea. So, but he sold the patents. So for like $1,000. I wouldn't be here right now if
today's dollars, that's probably worth quite
maybe a little more. So he started a company, though, a furniture manufacturing company, where he had actually started with that idea of creating furniture and specifically hideaway beds and rollaway cots, apparently. Well, it's great. He operated the business successfully through his lifetime. When he retired, my grandfather took over. He ran the business. And then what happened in the next generation? It was all daughters. And the daughters were well taken care of, including my mother. So what do? they weren't involved with the business, right? And so they're struggling to find a successor. So here we made it one generation in, it's time to make it 2 generations in, and an outsider takes over the company. So they hire someone to run the business, and it doesn't go well. And again, that's why I'm standing here in front of you today, and not off an island on Fiji or something. But bottom line is, again, it happens when there's no set plan in place. Had they started much earlier, that may not have happened within my family, but they didn't. And so it got to that point where, uh-oh, what do we do now? And they just hired someone, and it didn't go well. So when we talk about succession planning, there are really 2 sides. One is a planned exit. Not a big surprise. The other is an unplanned exit. So what do we mean by this? Well, a planned exit, you can picture it this way. I'm a business owner. I'm alive. I want to transition out of my business. So I am there to negotiate the sale of my business. I'm there to consult with the attorneys, with the CPAs, with the valuation experts to figure out what is the best plan from a tax standpoint, from a personal retirement planning standpoint. I'm there to decide how it's best going to suit me. But, and ultimately I'm there to accept or decline any kind of offers as well. So I'm there to negotiate everything. That's a planned exit. On the other side, we've got the unplanned exit, the unforeseen event. So that's where you've got everything that's unknown. And if there's no plan in place, again, you're really stuck with the variables that you have in effect at that time. So you're stuck with your succession situation. Who's going to take over the business? You're stuck with the value of the business at that point in time. You are stuck with any purchaser who is going to buy it and what they're going to offer. You don't have control over those things anymore. Because at that point, the business likely has to be sold or has to be transitioned. And so it's very different from the planned exit. And for the family, in the end, they could be forced to accept an offer that is not in the best interest of the family. So, not always a good situation, again, when there's no planning in place. So, why plan for succession? Well, we start with taxes. Always my favorite from the estate tax perspective or income taxes. You have to look at both sides when selling a business, either during lifetime or at death. Risk. It could be risk of not receiving full value. It could be risk of not having all the options available, which goes along with the next item up there. The more planning that's done, the more options there are available. If there isn't planning that's done, then the options become very limited because usually those who are stepping in, that is the family, are stuck with the variables that, again, are provided in front of them. Control is a huge issue. And for any business owner, of course, they want control of their business. They don't want to relinquish control. Having control of the situation of selling the business is equally as important. And you lose control when you don't have the planning in place. And last, the bottom line of it all, maximizing the value. How do you maximize the value? You plan, right? There are ways to plan. There are ways to prep the business balance sheet and the financials to put the business in a position so that it's going to maximize value when it's actually sold. So those are the common reasons why succession planning is important. And in the end, a good succession plan is going to meet the needs and goals of the business owner. There's no big surprise there. But it'll also meet the needs of the other important stakeholders in the business. Who might that be? Well, it's key employees, it's other owners, it is family members, it is potentially creditors or employees. I mentioned employees. It could be really anyone who is around the business, the family being probably the most important one, making sure that they're going to receive the same income from the business or will receive full and fair value so that they can maintain the same standard of living if that business owner is gone. And a good planning process is going to take everyone's wishes and objectives into account. So you can't just look at things in a vacuum and say, okay, what's best for the business owner today? You've got to look down the line as well and really look at it from the standpoint of all of those people who are involved in the business. So, we'll talk about the planned exit first. Some of the common objectives, no big surprise here, a smooth transition. And I was in private practice as an estate and business planning attorney for about 12 years before I moved to my current position 11 years ago. And when I moved my business to another firm, the most important thing for me was making sure that, number one, my clients were taken care of, right? Well, along with that, number two, I also wanted to make sure that it was going to be a good arrangement for the purchaser of my business. Because if it was good for them, then it meant ultimately that it was going to be good for me too with the way our arrangement was structured. So making sure that it works for the buyers to make sure that that's a smooth transition and maximizing the value of the business and maximizing also the opportunity for success for the sellers, the employees, and customers as well, and creditors should be part of that too. Making sure that all those people involved are feeling good about the transition, because what happens if they're not? Employees, they start listening to offers coming from other businesses, or if you've got customers, all of a sudden there's a phone call that can say, you know, you've heard what happened with that business that you've been working with, right? They're not doing too well. Oh yeah, I better leave because it wasn't a smooth transition. That smooth transition is so important. And in addition, if it's a lifetime buyout, making sure that there's retirement income for the seller. Commonly, the seller needs that income coming in to make sure that, again, they can maintain the same standard of living. I had a meeting about 2 weeks ago with the owner of a local electric company. And he has 2 sons and 2 nephews involved in the business. And I was asking him, okay, so how do you want to transition this business? Well, the first question was, okay, so when do you want to get out? What do you think he said?
Never.
Yeah. No, tomorrow. Yeah, tomorrow if I could. No, it's one or the other.
Yeah.
It's either tomorrow or, yeah,
I'm in the middle.
I'm not leaving, unless I'm forced to leave. But yeah, he wanted to get out immediately. But he said, same thing that, and the story that I mentioned earlier, yeah, but you know, my kids, one of them is getting closer to being ready to take over, but we're looking at probably 5 years before that's actually gonna happen. And so, next question is, okay, what do you need from the business? Do you need income continuing to come from the business? And he said, you know, that's a hard question to answer. And you know, I have done the retirement planning, and I have personal assets, but I probably still am going to need some income coming from the business. I think the business is worth about $5 million. I probably just need $1 million from it, which is great, right? Good for the kids and the nephews. But you know, that's not also the most practical thing as well. And his wife might have something to say about that if he's not around too. But you never know what you're going to hear, but you have to ask those questions. So when you're talking about the sale of a business during lifetime, again, one of the first questions is when? You know, when do you want to get out? And this is where, in a lot of meetings, I'm having these conversations with business owners, and again, that question is answered, yeah, I want to get out tomorrow. Well, they should have been doing some longer-term planning if that was the case. It takes a minimum of 2 years to put the books in condition to really maximize the value of the company. And my suggestion is always start planning 5 years out. 5 years is a good time frame to, again, get the books in great shape and really make the business look profitable and, again, maximize value. That's the end goal. So when you know, from a time perspective, when the owner wants to get out, then it's, well, who's the successor going to be? And sometimes that business owner is looking at it saying, yeah, it's going to be a key employee, or it's going to be, my business partners. Well, those are the easy ones. But it's those where the business owner says, yeah, I have no idea. And I know that there are at least a couple of you in the room who've had those conversations with your business owner clients and asked the question, okay, so who would take over the business? Yeah, I don't really know. Well, that's always the question. And so identifying that successor is going to be paramount, one of the first questions that has to be answered. how much of the business is going to be purchased? And I'll get more into that in just a minute. The value of the business interest being purchased, that's the magic question. Every business owner wants to know what their company is worth. And they have an idea in their mind. Sometimes they're really pleased with what comes back, and sometimes they're not. Usually they're way off, one way or the other. How the purchaser is going to pay the purchase price. Is it going to be in a lump sum, or is it going to be over a term of years? And whether the seller's involvement is necessary for a transition that's going to maximize the value and, again, make it smooth. And that is one of the most interesting questions, because most of the time, the business owner has to stay involved to some degree to help make that handoff. So, first, talking a little more in detail about the successor. So, I mentioned, the easy ones are the business partners, and they are, because you've identified who it is. If there are 3 owners of a business, and if one of them wants to get out, and the other 2 aren't about the same age, then, okay, it makes it a little bit easier. If they are the same age, you get 3, as I mentioned earlier, with the 3 brothers, who 2 of them were in their late 60s and one was in his early 70s. They're all around the same age. And okay, so who's going to exit the business first? 3 hands go up. So you have to be, you have to have a plan to make sure that it's going to transition to the right people, and maybe it's for those 3 to find the successor. The successor is not those 3 individuals. If it's going to be a family member, is it estate planning or is it succession planning? And yeah, they're one and the same. You can't talk about the estate plan without talking about the succession plan, and vice versa. But are you going to sell the business to your children, or are you going to leave it to them? And part of that depends on what the surviving spouse might need from an income standpoint. Does the surviving spouse still need income coming from the business to maintain the same standard of living if something should happen to the business owner? So it could be an estate planning case where, okay, I'm just going to leave the business to my kids, or I'm going to leave it to my one child involved in the business and leave everything else to the other kids, which that gets into a whole other dynamic on the estate planning side. And that's where estate equalization commonly comes in, and yeah, it's leaving equal assets, but I have to give the plug for life insurance because I'm from First Element. So that is where commonly the other assets don't equal the value of the business. So the business may be worth $5 million, the other assets are $3 million, and there are 3 kids, one involved in the business. So leave the $5 million asset to the child involved in the business. Well, just leave $1.5 million to the other 2 kids. We can increase what's being left to the other kids with life insurance. And a lot of times when I have those discussions with business owners, they're saying, yeah, I don't necessarily need to leave a full $5 million to each of my other kids, because this child involved in the business has been working for them, and they've been growing the business, and they've been involved. So, these kids, I'm just handing them cash. It doesn't seem very equal. And maybe it's not equal. Maybe it's fair, but not equal. So if it's a key employee, the common question you get is, all right, well, yeah, but how would they pay for it? And that's a really good question. When it comes down to the financials of the company, especially when you're talking about a planned exit, you have to look at the cash flow that's coming from the company, and if the business owner was removed, so they didn't own the company anymore, well, that frees up cash flow that was going to them previously that now could be used to pay the purchase price. So it becomes a math game and really figuring out how the computation works and what kind of payments can be supported. And then the easiest one, of course, is an outside third party, right? You negotiate a sale. If they pay in cash, great. If they go out and get a bank loan, that's great. But hopefully it's a lump sum that's being paid. And that usually makes for a happy business owner to have that liquidity to get out. Yes, sir?
On the employees, do you ever cover ESOPs then?
Yes. Yes, so now, but what I tend to find with ESOPs is I get a lot of questions for small businesses. And small businesses meaning the value of the business may be, $2 to $3 million. And that is not going to cut it for an ESOP. Usually you're talking at least a $10 million value minimum to really talk or consider an ESOP. But yes, it is a viable option when you have multiple employees and maybe you've got the leadership in place. And so it's really a question of giving the employees something that they feel like they can take ownership of through their retirement plan. And at the same time, you got a happy business owner because they are taking the cash out. Yes?
I don't want to get too far off track, but are you able to just briefly explain why a company wouldn't be a candidate for an ESOP until they're perhaps at the 10 million level?
So usually it's administration costs, and it's a cost to put the plan in place. And you know, there is usually a study that has to occur to make sure that the company is a viable candidate. And you know, I'm not one of those people who performs those studies, but there are companies out there that's all they do, and they determine the viability ultimately. But usually it's a question of the cost and the administration that goes into it.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure. All right, so the next part of the planned exit is how much of the business is going to be purchased. And it's easy if the business owner says, yeah, I'm ready to get out now. Ready to get out, one. And two, whatever that next leadership group looks like, they're ready to take over. So that's the perfect situation. But we don't always have the perfect situation. So maybe they're selling a controlling interest in the company. More than likely, if you've got leadership that's not ready to take over yet, it's selling a minority interest in the company. Or it could be gifting a minority interest in the company, starting a gifting plan where they're gifting to children if they're involved in the business. But it's a question of how much control they want to give up and how quickly. And how quickly they're comfortable giving it up as well. And then, is it an asset purchase or is it a purchase of the actual company? You know, you do have liability concerns when you sell an entire business, and this is of course coming straight from the attorney's mouth. You know, when you're buying a business, when you're buying the name, when you're buying everything about it, then you're also buying the liabilities of that company. So if anything were to come back to haunt you, you can do all the due diligence in the world that you want to. It doesn't mean that there's going to be some kind of claim that pops up that wasn't expected. And then if you do opt to go with an asset purchase as opposed to the purchase of the actual company itself, then are you giving up the goodwill, the name, and the reputation that the company has built up? And maybe to a degree you are. And there are a lot of small businesses that they would do well to keep that small field name in place. And because of liability, the attorneys recommend against it. So again, every situation is different and unique, but these are all considerations that go into it. All right, so then we get to value, which is, that's always, again, the business owner's favorite topic of discussion, unless it comes back contradictory to what they're thinking the value of the business was, and not in a positive way. But there are different approaches. First of all, when you're looking at actually selling a business today, clients have to get formal valuations completed. Yes, they're expensive. Yes, they can be anywhere from $5,000 to $10,000 plus in cost. But they need to know what the value of the business is if they're actually going to sell it, because that is a once-in-a-lifetime decision. They don't get to rewind and do it over again. So get it right the first time and spend the money, even though I know it pains them and they don't want to. But still, it makes sense to do it. You know, there are informal valuations that can be completed too. For a lot of valuation firms, they'll perform what's called a calculation of value, which is taking a lot of the factors into account that are taken into account with a full-blown valuation, but it's just a dumbed-down version. I still don't even recommend that when your client is actually going to go sell the business today. When they're looking to sell the business, they need to know what it's worth. They need to know what comparable businesses are selling for. And so the best way to do that is to have a full-blown valuation. But what it all comes down to with any value of a business is what the future cash flows look like. If I am the buyer of the business, what's the one thing I want to make sure that I did? Recoup my investment, right? So if all goes well, we've got a full transition plan in place, it's gonna be a smooth transition. How long is it going to take me to recoup my investment? And the magic number, time frame, seems to be 5 years. No one likes to go beyond 5 years. You start talking 10 years, well, why would I invest in a company and wait 10 years to get my money back out of it? I would rather do it in a shorter period of time. And so that's, again, a big part of the due diligence process to figure out how the numbers work out and whether the numbers can support the cash flow that would be needed to be able to recoup that investment. And so you're looking commonly at multiple of EBITDA. That's a very simple formula to look at when you're looking to see, okay, what could the business potentially be worth? Again, if your client's going to sell today, they want to get a valuation, but if you're looking at a multiple of EBITDA, then it varies by industry. But again, in that anywhere from 3 to 5 times, depending on industry, is a realistic area to be in. A lot of clients, when I have the valuation conversation, they say, well, yeah, my company's doing $6 million, so we'll usually just double that, and we figure the company's worth about $12 million. Okay, well, that's the gross revenue, so it doesn't tell you anything about how long it would take to recoup an investment or a buyer, and so you really can't look at a multiple of any type of gross revenue. So it always comes back to some kind of multiple of net profit. All right, so I can take a drink. Any questions there yet?
So,
All right.
you might get into this, but a number of the clients that Tom and I both work with are sole practitioners of dental offices.
Yeah.
So, when I've brought up this topic in the past, the typical response from the dentist is, well, I'm planning on working 5 or 8 years or 10 years or whatever, and I'll find a recent dental school grad or something like that for my succession plan. So, they're making a decision to fail to plan. So,
Yeah.
what are some of the elements that I can really use to influence them to see this with a lot more serious eye than they are today?
Yeah, it's a great question, and there are usually 2 potential options when that's the case.
Mm-hmm.
Number 1 is find a friendly competitor,
Okay.
potentially an office that's 5 miles down the road, and work out an agreement where if they're both solo practitioners, then they'll buy each other out in the event that one of them would pass away or become incapacitated. Now that's in the event of a death scenario,
Right.
or again disability. During lifetime, what's more common is to again have to identify the successor. So first, yes, are there any friendly competitors out there who would have an interest in buying the business, taking over the practice? With professional practices, what I tend to find more often is they do find someone young out of school to step in, someone who they can train, and
Right.
hopefully it works out. But they have to do it far enough in advance as well, because when you have a business owner saying, yeah, I want to get out in 3 years. Okay, but I don't have my successor hired yet. Well, is 3 years really long enough to be able to hire someone, train them, and figure out if they're a good fit to take over the business? In most cases, probably not.
Right.
So again, I'd say minimum would be 5 years, and in that context, perfect world, it's 8 to 10 years. And that should provide enough time to figure out if that person is indeed going to be the successor, 1. 2, if at some point they figure out, yeah, this is the person, then give them an ownership stake, a small minority interest at an early point. They can feel like they have some kind of vested interest and actually put a plan in place that will transition the business at a certain point in time. But I know that's easy for me to stand up here and say. It's a whole different thing to convince a business owner when it's their business, and especially when they're looking at hiring someone that takes revenue out of their pocket. So there are a lot of considerations that go into it. But again, they have to take it into account, the transition plan into account as they're planning that future. So looking at how the purchaser is going to pay the purchase price, during a lifetime buyout, if the lump sum is not an option, then commonly we'll look to installment payments. And again, that's where we look to the cash flow. And what does the cash flow support? And making payments over a period of time. And the key element of that is what I mentioned before, that immediate ownership transfer also transfers the net profits. So the business owner no longer owns the business at that point. You've got net profits coming from the company. It's just a question of redirecting those instead of paying those profits over to the employer as compensation, the exiting owner as compensation. Instead, those funds are redirected and are classified as buyout funds. So it's just, again, kind of restructuring what the funds are used for. Smaller ownership transfers is going to transfer smaller profits. So if it's going to be a minority interest, maybe that's a good thing. Maybe, again, transferring a small portion of the profits is good, and that'll make that employee who's going to step in and take over feel good about the fact that they own something, and oh, look at the profit that I'm getting. I'm receiving distributions every year. And just think, when I take over, it's going to explode and be much more. So that's a good thing. But again, whatever that the transfer of those profits is going to be, if it's a small minority interest that's transferred, then it's going to be a small amount of the profits that's transferred. So the math still has to work out. And then the other risk that's involved with installment payments is that it's completely dependent on the success of the business. So if there's a business owner who sells the business, says, okay, I'm out today, and I'm going to take installment payments back over 5 years. What happens when that buyer runs the business into the ground? And so no longer is that the same net profit being distributed. It won't even pay for the installment payments. Then that's where the lawsuits come up and the attorneys get involved. So again, it's not the preferred way to handle the transition of the business unless the owner is keeping a hand in it and making sure that it actually does successfully transition. So another option is third-party financing. So that is when literally the buyer goes out and secures a loan and pays the purchase price to the seller. That's going to depend on some factors which completely depend on what the circumstances are at the time. The creditworthiness of the buyer being the first one. But the state of the credit markets, go back to 2008, 2009. Before we ran into some issues with mortgage-backed securities and all those good things. The credit markets were wide open, right? Practically anyone could go get a loan. Well, all of a sudden, 2008, 2009 hit, and that wasn't the case anymore. It wasn't so easy to get a loan. So again, you're leaving it up to a lot if you're saying, okay, well, I'm just going to leave it to the buyer to go get a loan. The nice part is that we're talking about a lifetime sale of the business. So if the buyer can't get a loan, then the seller's not going to sell the business to him. Works very different in an unplanned exit situation when if there's a debt. And so the loan has to come into play and the individual can't get a loan for one reason or another. Then it's a big problem. So the last and probably most important part about a lifetime transfer to me is how involved does the seller need to be to transition this business successfully? A lot of business owners, sellers will stay on a consulting agreement. And so they'll receive part of their compensation that way. So actually as employment income. And they, in essence, are working under this consulting agreement, and as things come up in the business, then that individual is going to be compensated. And it may be that they are pledging to work 10 hours a week, 20 hours a week, something where they're coming in and making sure that things are successfully transitioning. Have the buyer's job responsibilities increase? And this gets back to, again, looking at the cash flows and how the cash flows are affected. Because if you've got a buyer and all of a sudden they had a certain amount of work that they had to do, but now the seller has completely exited the business, what was the seller doing for the business? Does the buyer need to hire someone to take over those responsibilities? And how much does that eat into profit? Control and management. So, this is where you get into a lot of issues with business owners where they don't want to give up control. They want to continue to make the decisions until they actually get all their money out of the company. And that can be a difficult one to talk them down from. But that's why again, starting that process of identifying future leadership is so important, because when they get to that point of being comfortable with the leadership that's stepping in, they're a whole lot more likely to give up control and management of the company. Are they going to receive salary for the job? I just was working on a succession plan not long ago where there was an agreement that was entered into 5 years ago, and much of the transition has already occurred, and the final piece occurs at the end of this year, actually January 1st, 2020. And as part of that, the two selling owners, and there are 3 buyers, key employees, the 2 selling owners are going to remain on for a period of 3 years as employees, just earning compensation. But they are there to, number one, earn compensation, because that was part of the arrangement. They wanted to continue to receive funds from the sale. And along with that, they wanted to stay involved to make sure that everything goes okay with the business. So it's a little bit of a combination of several of these things. Probably the least thought of issue, and I see buyout agreements all the time that are missing this. When a seller sells the business, I want to make sure that there's some kind of non-compete or non-solicitation agreement that's built in. The last thing you want is for a sale of the business to occur, and then for the seller to take all their money and say, okay, you know what, I'm going to go open up a competing business right next door. But it's shocking how many times this is missing from agreements, but it's a major issue that should be included every single time. All right, so then the structure of the sale, this kind of goes along with what we were saying. You know, there could be a down payment, you know, there could be a loan term and interest rate. Obviously, that's dependent on market conditions. There could be an earnout. If it's a business transition where it relies heavily on relationships. And I will tell you, when I sold my law practice, my part of the sale was an earnout, right? However much of the business they retain, and however much business they retain from my referral sources in particular, was going to dictate how much compensation I actually received for the sale of my practice. So an earnout can be a great way to help keep people involved, because I did stay involved for a 2-year period to make sure that it was going to be a successful transition. And then potentially salary as an employee, which we've talked about. All right, so then we get to the emergency exit and the plan that should be put in place there. The common objectives here, it's no longer to provide for retirement income for the business owner. It's no longer to make sure that the business owner receives full and fair value. It becomes all about the family and making sure that the family receives full and fair value for the interests in the business. What any exit plan, unplanned exit plan, should accomplish is prearranging all of the terms of what would happen in the event that an owner passed away or became disabled. The last thing you want to do is leave it to negotiation at the time, because the family is usually at a significant disadvantage. If they don't have the experience of running the business and being involved day to day, then at that point, again, they're at a disadvantage, because usually the end result is they have to sell for pennies on the dollar. On the other side, when there are multiple business owners, let's say you've got 3 owners and one of them passes away, well, do the 2 owners want to be in business with the spouse of the deceased owner? Probably not. So keeping the business in the control of the remaining owners is a common objective. And then providing assurances to creditors and employees. I mentioned it before, but this can't be understated. It is remarkable the number of times I've heard about situations, and even in private practice, several times saw when an owner passed away, employees felt like there was a lot of disarray within the company, and that things were just in a state of flux. And so what they do, they started bailing, they started jumping ship. So you start losing the employees, and then next thing you know, you start losing customers on top of that. So again, making sure that with any kind of unplanned exit, that it's going to provide for that smooth transition in the end, that is going to make everyone comfortable that, okay, this business is not going to skip a beat, or if it skips a beat, it's going to be a little beat, nothing major. So here, same thing. Question is, who is the successor going to be? If you've got multiple business owners, it's a little bit easier, but we'll talk about that more in a minute. You have to look at the value of the business interest being purchased, and that's a little trickier when you're talking about not a sale now, but later on. We don't know when it's going to be, but we're trying to plan for every unforeseen event. How the purchaser is going to pay the purchase price, and then whether the seller's unplanned exit poses any additional risk to the company itself, which if it's a seller who is involved in the day-to-day affairs, then that is quite commonly the case. We'll talk more about that. So first, the successor. Again, the easy situation, you've got 3 owners, one of them passes away, great. The other 2 are going to take over ownership of the business. Family member, potentially, and that's where you have that same discussion. Okay, is it an estate planning situation? Is it instead a succession planning issue where we need to have a buy-sell agreement? And by the way, when I talk about buy-sell agreements, it could be a shareholder agreement. It could be an operating agreement for an LLC that has buyout provisions built into it. It's I was asked that question at a presentation not too long ago. So what if my client doesn't have an agreement that says buy-sell on it, but they have an operating agreement? It very well may include buyout provisions, but it just depends on the agreement. Some attorneys include it, some don't. It could be a key employee who's buying out the business interest, and then it could be an outside third party. We'll go through each of these. Actually, one thing to add about the outside third party here. So this is getting to that exact situation that Mr. Klayman here asked about, which is, if you've got an outside third party who's going to buy out the interest of the business, usually it's going to be a friendly competitor when you have a prearranged agreement for a buyout. There's usually not going to be I'll say a non-friendly or unfriendly competitor who is going to enter into an agreement to buy out if there's a debt. They might buy out and acquire you during lifetime, but not in the death context or not in the disability context. So then we get to the value of the interest being purchased. And again, this comes back to valuation of the business. For an unplanned exit, it's a little bit different, can be viewed a little bit differently, which is the business owners do have the opportunity to get together once a year at an annual meeting and set the value for the next year. That's my preferred method for any buy-sell agreement, is to say, okay, if any one of us dies or becomes disabled in the next year, unless we change the amount, here's what the purchase price is going to be. If there hasn't been a valuation in the last year, because that happens all the time, I review agreements that say, yes, every year they are to revalue the business. And there's that initial value that was put in place 14 years ago, and they haven't updated it since. So you have to have a backup formula in place, and that's where you'll get to one of these other options. But having a certificate of agreed value, and that's usually done with the CPA involved as well, that can be a really good way to list it within a buy-sell agreement. And something else that people will, that a lot of attorneys build into agreements is getting appraisals and having valuation experts value the business. And my favorite is, yes, each side will get their own valuation expert, and if they're not within 10%, then they have to go out and bring in a third valuation expert. So you're paying for 3 full valuations, and that third valuation has to decide what the number is between valuation expert 1 and valuation expert 2, and valuation expert 3 decides what the value is. So very costly way to do it as compared to potentially just saying, okay, yeah, for the next year, here's what it is. So same thing goes, you're going to take the same variables into account where when you're looking at what the value is, the difference is that it's commonly built into a formula. So they're going to be looking at future cash flows of the business and how long it's going to take for a buyer to recoup their investment. Still factors, multiple of EBITDA, these are all viable ways of valuing the business, but it has to be built into a formula that's in the agreement because we don't know when the buyout event is going to happen. It could happen in 5 years, it could happen in 10 years, 15, 20, or it may never happen. Who knows? All right, and so then in the unplanned exit context, how is the purchaser going to pay the purchase price? Well, A death situation is easy, right? Buy a life insurance policy on each owner, and if there's a death, you've got cash when it's needed, you've leveraged up the premium dollars into that death benefit that is gonna fully pay the funds when they're needed. That's easy. It becomes a little more complicated when you're looking at a disability situation. There is what is called disability buyout insurance. It is not the least expensive insurance product out there, so a lot of business owners tend to shy away from it, but I've also seen some that have put it in place because they felt strongly enough that if there was a disability, they wanted to make sure that there was a lump sum that was going to the family, then disability buyout insurance is a good way to do it. Otherwise, you're left with one of the other methods, installment payments and credit, going out and getting a loan. Those are a little more dangerous in these circumstances because one, with installment payments, you've got someone taking over the business owner has been removed from the business. Is that business going to have the same level of success? And the business owner isn't there anymore to step in and make sure that it's going to achieve that level of success. So there is some danger there that the business could, again, suffer a downturn and they can't afford those installment payments. Third-party financing, again, you don't know when that credit credit need is going to come about. So is it going to be a good credit market? Is it not going to be a good credit market? Is the buyer going to be in good financial circumstances to be able to go out and get the credit? Who knows? And so the last one, which is always my favorite, is a sinking fund, which is literally taking cash flow from the operating revenue of the company and putting it into a side fund and building it up over time. But the perfect example of this was many years ago, I met with two business owners who were building up a sinking fund, and this is how they were going to handle a buyout. And they said, okay, yeah, we have a sinking fund. Fantastic. But what's the value of the sinking fund? It is about $896,000, so the goal was to get it to $1 million. Great, so when did you put this plan in place? It was almost 10 years ago. So what's the value of the business today? It's probably worth about $5 million. So here they've got the sinking fund that it took so long to build up to almost $1 million, and the value of the business is no longer $2 million like it once was, so $1 million to fund a buyout. Now it's $5 million, they need $2.5 million there. So the value of the sinking fund usually doesn't keep up with what they need for the buyout. Part two to that is, oh, yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, part two is if the company needs money for any reason, what's the first place they're going to look? In the sinking fund, right? It's cash sitting there. Of course they're going to take it if they've got that need for capital for any reason, and they're going to use it. So that is happens all too often. So sinking funds, I've seen probably 3 in my career where they've actually kept up with the value of the business and have built up a sinking fund to where it needs to be. And that's out of dozens. So they don't work usually. So it usually happens that way where the company itself will fund the obligation. And of course, if the company pays the life insurance premiums that are owned by other entities or other individuals, then there's going to be some taxes associated with that. So at that point, it might be a bonus up with additional money that's paid out to the individuals. Or I've also seen situations where there was one very healthy business owner and one very unhealthy business owner, and they recognized that it was not fair, and so they didn't have the business pay for it. The one who had the higher cost with the insurance actually agreed to pay that additional cost in a way that they took less compensation from the company. So that's an option as well. That always gets into an interesting situation because when I start talking about options, when clearly there's a major disparity in what those premiums are going to cost, I'm always interested to see where the discussion is going to go. You just never know. Usually you see one person talking and saying, well, yeah, I don't really think it's fair because I'm going to be paying a lot more, and you just see the other person say, well, yeah, but it's an expense that it's really of the company. It's not for us individually, and just kind of wondering where that goes. And sometimes you just have to talk through it in a little more detail there.
They're all very fair equalization focused
Yes.
guy. So
Yes.
not a conversation I'm
Okay.
worried about going into, but
That's good.
What's the framework to think about that? And I love that approach.
Yeah, yeah. So what it boils down to is, do you want the company to pay for it, or do you want for the individual owners who are going to cost more for insurability to pay for it? You can do a trustee cross purchase, yes. So now that doesn't get around the same issue as far as premium payments go. They can still be unequal, but you absolutely can. So what that would save you from is, think about this. If you've got 5 owners for the business, they each have to have a life insurance policy on all the other owners if there's going to be a cross-purchase arrangement, right? That is what a cross-purchase is. Each owner owns a policy on each of the other owners' lives. So that would require 20 life insurance policies. Yeah, great for someone who sells insurance, but probably something that most clients aren't interested in. So the trustee arrangement is where a trustee literally holds one policy on the life of each owner and handles the transaction in the event that there is a death. And so that you only have to maintain that one policy on each owner's life. So you can, it still gets back to the same issue though. Is the company gonna pick up the cost, or are the individuals gonna pick up the cost who are costing more on the insurance side? It does, and I see that all the time where they wanna keep the real estate and receive that retirement income, and use the lease payments as retirement income, yes. So that happens all the time, all the time. And the objectives can be different, but especially when it's a family-owned business and you've got the real estate and then you've got the operating entity. The business owner wants to get out of the operating entity, but they just see the business as something, well, why can't we just sign a long-term lease and lock them in so that I'm gonna make sure that I continue to receive rental income and meet any kind of retirement need, and then potentially discount the price of the operating entity in the sale. Oh, yeah.
Fortunately, he kept the building.
Well, making sure that the cash flow, again, can support whatever the needs are. And that's one of those things where you're unfortunately, there's a risk there every time. It depends on how that business continues to operate and is going to continue to generate the same amount of revenue. Just to talk some basics on buy-sell. Buy-sell agreement, I've got the definition up here, but you know, what I would tell you is this, it's something that has to be drafted by an attorney. I'm asked all the time by advisors, can you just provide some kind of sample agreement that they can just, you know, write it up on their own? No, I can't do that. It is something that every business is different and really does require a very individualized buy-sell agreement that's going to meet their specific needs. So it should be drafted by an attorney, and probably the worst agreement that I've ever reviewed in my career, I'm reviewing it, and it was for an automotive repair company. And I'm reading this agreement, and it just doesn't fit their situation at all. So I sit down and meet with the advisor that is his clients. I said, so I gotta ask, what attorney drafted this? He said, oh, we didn't. We got this form on the internet, and we just plugged in our names. Okay, well, that explains a lot. So it has to be drafted by an attorney and one who specializes in corporate or mergers and acquisitions law. The 3 common types of agreements are unilateral. So this is where you've got a buy-sell agreement obligating a key employee usually to buy out the interests of the owner in the event that the owner would pass away, become disabled, or voluntarily leave the business. So it's called unilateral because there's one obligation, that is only the purchase obligation on the part of one party. You've got the cross-purchase arrangement, which we talked about, that is most commonly used with 2 individuals, and that is because of the multiple life insurance policy issue. So if you've got 2 individuals, they each would be obligated under the buy-sell agreement to buy out the other's interests in the event that one of those triggering events occurred. And then you've got an entity purchase arrangement. And entity purchase being when you have a situation where you've got 6 different owners. Well, the company itself can have the obligation to buy out the interests of an owner. And that's a stock redemption plan as well, also goes by that name. And the only reason that a lot of situations dictate not using an entity purchase arrangement would be if it is a C Corp, because there's no step up in basis on the deceased owner's interest when the purchase occurs. So if that makes sense. With a cross-purchase arrangement, Mike and I own a business together, and I pass away. See how I did that? I didn't have you pass away. I pass away, then at that point, Mike is obligated to buy out my interest. Well, when he buys out my interest from my family, his basis for capital gains purposes in what he just purchased is the purchase price. So if we had a basis of 0, say, and the company was worth $1 million, well, let's say it's worth $2 million, and I pass away, then he's got to pay $1 million for my interest in the business. So his basis in his 1/2 interest is still 0, but in the new 1/2 interest that he just acquired from me, it's $1 million. So if he goes to sell it during lifetime, he doesn't have to pay capital gains tax on what he purchased from me if he sells it for $2 million. Does that make sense? Yeah, so the same is not true with an entity purchase arrangement. There's no step up in basis on the deceased owner's interest. And that's because the company is buying out the interest. So same situation, Mike and I own this business, $2 million of total value, and I die. Well, at that point, the company buys out my interest. Mike still owns the same number of shares that he did before. The only difference is that they've increased in value, but his basis hasn't changed at all. So there's a workaround with an S Corp, so that's not as big of an issue as long as you're working with a CPA who knows what they're doing, but not with a C Corp. So just something to keep in mind.
Excuse me, what about goodwill?
Sorry?
What happens to the goodwill?
Well, that depends on the circumstances. Completely depends on the books, and that's something that I would leave for the CPA under the circumstances. But much of it depends on how the books are structured in the first place. And then you've got funded versus unfunded arrangements. Where's the money going to come from? And with a funded arrangement, that's where, again, life insurance is in place, disability insurance is in place. Unfunded is when there's nothing provided for. Most agreements will provide that if life insurance or disability insurance is to be applied first, if there's any additional amount that's owed based on the formula that's in place at the time, then that amount would have to be paid over a 5-year period through installment payments. Again, 5 years being the magic number. Probably 90% of the agreements that I review include a 5-year installment buyout as a backup. All right, before I move on to our last topic, any questions on that? Yeah, so funded is, a funded buy-sell agreement is when you have set a plan for the cash to be available when it's needed. So that's going to be through life insurance, that's going to be through disability insurance, that's going to be through a sinking fund, making sure that the cash is actually there when it's needed. Unfunded is not providing for the cash to actually be there, but having a plan to provide for the cash after the fact. That is installment payments or relying on a loan. All right, so this is somewhat difficult to read at the bottom, but it says it's one of the advantages of having your own business, and it is the owner of the business looking, and he is the employee of the month. But the reality is that commonly business owners do play a major role in their own companies. And when I talk about key people within a business, you can liken it to the game of Jenga. Which I'm sure many of you, like me, like to play Jenga on Friday nights. So when you pull out a block, the tower wavers. That's your key person. You're really key if you pull that block out and it collapses. That's your key person, where there's any kind of risk that's posed to the company if something happens to that individual and they're no longer there. And so for an owner, again, owners are commonly very actively involved as employees in their business. It may be having special connections. It may be that they've got this great selling ability, and so they're driving a lot of the sales. It may be that they've got financial expertise or product design innovation. There was one case we had years ago where a company said, we want to provide an executive benefit plan to keep a key employee around and we also want key person insurance on this. And I said, great, well, so what do they do for the company? He said, blacksmith. I said, blacksmith, okay, interesting. Well, I asked some additional questions and came to find out that there are less than a handful of experts in this guy's trade in the entire country. And they said if this guy were to leave or something happened to him, we would be in a world of hurt. So they put an executive benefit plan that was going to pay an additional retirement benefit for him and also put $1 million of key person insurance so that if something happened to him, then they have the cash to go out and try to lure someone over from one of the other companies. And then it could be just straight leadership skills and having the knowledge of how the business is run. So the risk that if an owner were to pass away, the risk to the company commonly increase costs because they're going to go out and hire replacements, or it could be that customers get concerned and they bail, and so they start doing business with someone else. So the revenue of the company drops. Employees being concerned with things being again in disarray, like I mentioned earlier. What happens? Those employees leave, and I mentioned a revenue drop. So key person life insurance is a little bit different. It's not buy-sell insurance, which is commonly mislabeled as buy-sell, but key person insurance is there for the benefit of the company. So if a key individual of the company passes away, the company is the owner and beneficiary of the policy, so the life insurance death benefit pays out to the company, and the company has the cash that they need to do whatever they need to, whether it's just getting it by in the short term, whether it is going out and hiring a replacement, if it's just keeping a company afloat until it can be sold, whatever the case may be, there's cash available. I mentioned with this Smithsman that he had an executive benefit plan in place. Well, retaining key employees is equally as important to a lot of business owners. And if you have business owner clients and they're commonly talking about someone else who's really important in the company and clearly that person plays a major role, they probably don't want that individual to leave. So it's incentivizing them to stay by either giving them some kind of vested interest in the company, that is actually giving them some form of ownership of the company, or providing some kind of additional benefit for them. That is, it could be a retirement benefit. There are lots of different things that can be done. It always comes back to what the objectives of the business owner and the company are going to be. But to add one more element to it, in the event that a key employee passed away, in the event that an owner employee passed away, so owner employee passes away, but there's a key individual who business owner doesn't want to turn the business over to because they're kids who are ultimately going to take over. But business owner says, if I die, then this key employee has to stick around. If this key employee doesn't stick around, then this company is going to fail. Then you can put in place what's called a stay bonus or retention bonus. That is nothing more than a lump sum that is paid to that employee as long as they stick around for a certain period of time if the owner passes away. So owner passes away, key employee sticks around for a period of say 2 years, then that key employee receives a bonus of $250,000 or $500,000, potentially $1 million, whatever it's going to take to make sure that they don't go anywhere. And they can, again, help with that transition and make sure that the business is going to stay afloat and continue at the same high level of operation. All right, so to wrap up, well, I say that your role in the planning process is to help develop a planned exit strategy and make sure that there is an unplanned exit strategy in place. Really, the main point is to have the conversation with your business owner clients. It's really a conversation that should happen with every single business owner to say, okay, do you have a transition plan in place? And when do you want to exit the business? Who's the successor going to be? Those are the two key elements. Everything else you can figure out. But those are the two key ones where they really need to start thinking and planning ahead. And they may say, yeah, I'm probably wanting to exit in 5 years or so. Great, now's the time to start planning. And so I always suggest starting it with, okay, do you have a buy-sell agreement? Or do you have an exit strategy for the business? And know that if you're not comfortable having that conversation, that's what I'm there for. That's a big part of what I do, have these conversations with advisors and their clients to just help ferret out what the plan is or should be. And a lot of times, it's not even insurance related. It is just a question of providing direction. If they're saying, yeah, I want to get out in 3 years, great, so what are your next steps? What do you need to do? And I can help outline those next steps for them. Using personal stories is so powerful in this area because business owners don't see that they don't see their own mortality. They think they're going to be involved in the business forever. And so when you can use stories that you may have seen with another business or steal one of mine, I've seen enough of them, but they can be really powerful to help motivate clients to actually take action. And then evaluating the current succession plan. If they're just looking at the unplanned exit, they're saying, yeah, we're way off for selling the business during lifetime. We want to plan for the unplanned exit, and we have a buy-sell agreement. And again, we have a process that's specifically designed to review a succession plan and outline if there are any updates legally that need to be made, if there are any updates that need to be made because the objectives or situation of the company have changed, or if they don't have a buy-sell agreement at all, then it's helping to map one out, let them know exactly what they need before they ever walk into the attorney's office. And really the key there is, again, you don't have to be the expert. That's why I'm here. So I like to think that I will have some continued employment as long as you continue to utilize me in that way. I appreciate that. So I made it through and voice stayed alive, so thank you for putting up with that. I think I got stronger as the time went on, which is always a good thing. But thank you, much appreciated.